The alarms were already screaming when I reached my command chair. Not proximity alarms. Not shield alarms. Something I had never heard in 200 years. Of service, the total failure cascade. Tone, the sound the system makes when it cannot decide which emergency to report. First, because every single one is happening at the same time. I am Commander Vreth Call of the Imperial Dominion, Supreme Fleet of the Third Armada, decorated veteran of 41 planetary conquests, and I want to tell you what happened at the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star at the edge of the Orion Arm. I want to tell you because I was there. I survived. And because the Emperor's court deserves to know the truth, not the version that protects careers and keeps medals shining. We arrived at the edge of their solar system with 400 warships at my back. 400. The number had felt almost embarrassing. When I received the assignment, the Imperial War Council had debated whether even 50 ships were necessary. They sent 400 as a show of dominion. Strength, not because they believed Earth required it, but because they wanted the humans to understand immediately and completely that resistance was not a concept worth considering. The briefing I received before departure had been thorough and deeply reassuring. Earth was a Class 4 primitive world. Single biosphere, no off-world colonies. No detected energy weapons above a certain yield threshold, no faster than light capability, no shields, no understanding of Dominion spatial technology. They had discovered the basics of atomic energy approximately 80 of their years ago and had spent a portion of that time pointing those weapons at each other rather than at the stars. The analysts at the Imperial Intelligence Bureau had been practically cheerful when they presented their findings. They are fractured, the lead analyst had told me, his 4 eyes bright with professional satisfaction. 93 distinct political entities on a single landmass system. They cannot agree on basic resource distribution. They have active conflicts in at least a dozen regions at any given time. Commander, these are not a unified species. They are a collection of arguing tribes who happen to share a planet. The moment our fleet appears above their sky, every one of those tribes will be looking at every other tribe wondering who is going to surrender first. I had laughed at that. So had the rest of the room. The Dominion had done this 91 times before. 91 species encountered, assessed, approached, and absorbed into the Empire. Not one of them had managed to present a meaningful defense. The closest anyone had come was the Velhari of the Second Kandor system, who had actually launched their entire space fleet, 43 ships, mostly research vessels, hastily fitted with weapons, directly at the Dominion Armada in what their historians would later call the Great Charge, and what Dominion historians would record simply as the Kandor Incident. A footnote, 3 sentences. I expected Earth to be a footnote too. My ship, the Eternal Mandate, was the largest vessel in the Armada, a command cruiser nearly 4 km long with enough firepower to reduce a continent to glass from orbit. Behind it, the fleet spread out in perfect geometric formation, the kind of formation that took centuries of tactical refinement to perfect. It was beautiful, honestly. I had always loved the look of it on the holographic display, all those blue markers arranged in precise expanding rings, the full might of the Dominion made visible. We dropped out of faster than light travel at the heliopause and immediately began our inward approach. The sensors came alive with data. 8 planets, one with a large natural satellite, 4 gas giants in the outer system, a dense asteroid belt in the middle, and their third from the star, a blue and white sphere roughly 14,000 km in diameter. Earth, exactly where the charts said it would be. My signals officer, a young Dominion named Proc 6, reported almost immediately that the planet's communication networks had detected us. This was expected. They had radio telescope arrays capable of detecting our energy signatures. The intelligence files had noted this. They're broadcasting on multiple frequencies, Prof 6 said. Radio, microwave, tight beam, optical. They know we're here. Of course they do, I said. Record everything. Translation teams will find it useful for the cultural absorption files. Yes, Commander. They are transmitting in many of their own languages simultaneously. It appears to be multiple different messages from multiple different governing bodies. Panicked governments reaching out independently, I said. Exactly as predicted. How long to optimal orbital insertion? At current approach speed. Approximately 18 hours. 18 hours. I considered this. We were in no hurry. In fact, a slower approach served us well. It gave the human governments time to observe the full scope of the Armada, to count the ships, to run whatever calculations their limited technology allowed, and arrive at the obvious conclusion. Surrender negotiations conducted with a species that had already mentally surrendered were considerably shorter. I decided to review the personnel files of my senior staff. There were commendations to sign, promotions to consider. Administrative work had a way of piling up during transit, and I expected the actual conquest of Earth to take perhaps 6 hours once we achieved orbit. Planetary subjugation of a pre-contact world typically required a demonstration of force, one strike on an uninhabited area followed by a demand for communication with the governing authority, followed by the formal capitulation ceremony, which I had conducted 41 times and could practically perform from memory. I went to my quarters and read personnel files for 3 hours. Then I ate. Then I reviewed the conquest protocols one more time, less because I needed to, and more because there was something satisfying about reading plans that were about to unfold exactly as written. At hour 6 of our approach, Prof 6 knocked on my door. Commander, he said, the humans have stopped broadcasting. I looked up from my desk. All channels. Every frequency we were receiving. It went quiet approximately 40 minutes ago. I waited to confirm it was not a temporary disruption before reporting. I thought about this. It was mildly unusual. Species who panic tended to keep broadcasting, pleading, negotiating, threatening, crying. The sudden silence was not something the intelligence files had predicted. Equipment failure on their end, I said, or they've decided on a unified negotiating position and imposed communication discipline. It is actually a good sign. It means someone is in charge. Prof 6 nodded and left. I returned to my files, but I found for some reason that I could not concentrate on them as easily as before. There was something about that silence, that sat in my mind like a pebble in a boot. Small, probably nothing, but present. I ordered the Armada to continue its approach and told myself I was being superstitious. In 200 years of service, not one species had ever given me genuine reason for concern. Earth would not be the first. That was not how the universe worked. That was not how the Dominion worked. I signed the commendations and tried to believe my own certainty. But the silence from the third planet stretched on, and I did not sleep as well as I should have that night. The morning of our 12th hour into the approach, I was on the bridge when Lieutenant Hoff brought me the sensor report that changed everything. It was not alarming on its face. That was the problem. If it had looked alarming immediately, I might have reacted faster. Instead, it looked like a minor data anomaly, the kind that sensor arrays occasionally produce in dense regions of space dust or when calibration drifts slightly during long transit. Commander, Hoff said, holding out the data tablet, there is a reading I cannot explain. I took the tablet. On the display was a wide field scan of the space between our current position and Earth orbit. The scan showed what the intelligence files had told us to expect, a scattering of small artificial satellites in various orbital bands, a handful of old spacecraft in parking orbits, the usual debris signature of a species that had been launching things into space for approximately 60 years, without much concern for tidiness. But there were also clusters, dense, irregular clusters of metallic signatures in positions that did not match any known human space asset. The intelligence files were exhaustive. On this point, the Dominion had been passively observing Earth's orbital infrastructure for decades. We knew what was up there, and these clusters were not in the files. When did these appear? I asked. That is what I cannot determine, Hoff said. The signatures are consistent with cold metal, no active power sources, no heat. Bloom, no electromagnetic output. They have been invisible to our long-range sensors because they are not doing anything. They are simply sitting there. Debris from a collision event. The distribution pattern is inconsistent with debris. Debris spreads outward from an origin point in a predictable pattern. These clusters are, Hoff paused, choosing words carefully, arranged. I looked at the display again. He was right. The clusters were not random. They occupied positions at varying orbital altitudes spread across multiple inclinations, covering arcs of space that, if you drew lines between them, formed something that looked less like an accident and more like a lattice, a three-dimensional lattice surrounding the approach vector that the Armada was currently traveling, and we were already inside it. The thought arrived quietly, without ceremony, and then sat in the center of my mind, radiating cold in all directions. Battle stations, I said. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that later. The bridge shifted immediately from routine operations to combat alert. Lights changed. Stations were manned. The sound of the ship changed subtly as power was redirected to weapons and shields. Hail the fleet, I said. All vessels, battle formation Delta. Shields to maximum. Weapons ready, but do not fire without my command. Prof 6 relayed the orders. On the holographic display, 400 blue Markers began repositioning with the elegant efficiency of a force that had practiced these maneuvers 10,000 times. It was at that moment that the single human vessel appeared. It came from above our approach plane, which was not where any of our sensors had been focused. It was, by any objective measure, small ship, perhaps 200 m from end to end, with an asymmetrical silhouette that suggested rapid construction or extensive modification. It was not sleek. It looked assembled rather than designed, with modules attached at angles that Dominion engineers would have found deeply uncomfortable. It positioned itself directly in front of the eternal mandate and stopped, precisely stopped, with a precision of navigation that I noted despite myself. Stopping at an exact point in open space requires sophisticated control systems. The files had said their navigation technology was primitive. Then it broadcast, not on radio, not on the frequencies the intelligence file said they used. It broadcast on Dominion's standard communication channels, the channels we used internally, the channels that required knowing Dominion signaling, coding, the channels that were not in any file we had ever transmitted to Earth. It broadcast in 17 Dominion languages, one after another in sequence, each perfectly accented, each grammatically correct. The message was identical in all 17. You have entered contested space. This is your only warning. Turn back. The bridge went completely silent. In 17 Dominion languages. 17. The Dominion had formal records of contact with over 300 species, and fewer than 40 had ever independently decoded more than 2 Dominion languages. This small, ugly, assembled-looking ship was broadcasting in 17 with perfect grammar in the correct sequence of diplomatic precedence, which meant they understood not just the language but the hierarchy of the Dominion's own communication protocols. Lieutenant Harv said nothing. Prof. 6 said nothing. My entire senior bridge crew said nothing. They were all looking at me. I want to tell you that I felt certainty in that moment. I want to tell you that the decorated veteran of 41 conquests, the commander of 400 warships, looked at that small human vessel and made a calm, calculated decision based on military doctrine and centuries of experience. I want to tell you that because it would be a more dignified account of what happened next. The truth is that something cold moved through my chest when I heard those 17 languages, and for just a moment, one very short, very quiet moment, I thought about turning the Armada around. Not out of fear, out of something older than fear, something the body knows before the mind does, the same thing that makes you stop walking when a room you're about to enter is too quiet. I did not turn around. I had 41 conquests behind me. I had 400 warships around me. I had the full authority of the Imperial Dominion and 6 centuries of unbroken conquest tradition and an emperor's mandate sealed with the imperial mark. I had every reason in every rational universe to dismiss that moment of cold quiet and issue the order I issued. Weapons officer, I said, destroy that vessel. The beam fired. I watched on the display as the targeting solution locked, tracked, and discharged a weapon that had carved holes in planetary shields and reduced fortified military stations to expanding clouds of vapor. The human ship moved, not to the left, Not to the right, not backward along its approach vector. It moved in a direction that my eyes registered but my mind refused to categorize for approximately 3 full seconds because the direction it moved was not a direction that a ship of that mass at that distance with that engine output should have been able to move. It moved the way water moves around a rock in a stream, not fighting the current, simply not being where the current was. The beam passed through empty space. Hav's voice when it came was very quiet. Commander, the clusters are activating. I looked at the display. Every one of those dark, cold, silent, metallic clusters, every single one of the objects that had shown no power signature, no heat, no electromagnetic output, the objects we had sailed past and through and around for 12 hours of careful approach, lit up simultaneously. Not a few of them, all of them, hundreds of them, positioned at every altitude, every inclination, covering every angle of approach and retreat and lateral movement, a three-dimensional web of weapons platforms that the armada of the Eternal Dominion was sitting directly inside of. They had been waiting, cold and dark and patient and waiting, for exactly the order I had just given. The first impacts hit the outer ring of the fleet 4 seconds later. I had time in those 4 seconds to understand something completely and clearly and with a certainty that I have never felt before or since. The humans had not stopped broadcasting 6 hours ago because they were panicking. They had not gone quiet because someone had taken charge and imposed communication discipline. They had gone quiet because they were busy. They had spent those 6 hours doing something else entirely. And then the alarm started screaming. All of them all at once, and the 400 warships of the Imperial Third Armada began to die. I'm going to tell you what 11 minutes feels like from inside a ship that is losing every system faster than the crew can respond to any of them. It does not feel like a battle. A battle has rhythm, strike in, counter-strike, advance and withdraw. Moments of pressure followed by moments of recovery. What happened to the Third Armada had no rhythm. It had only forward motion in one direction, like falling. I was still in my command chair when the first wave hit. The outer defensive ring, 40 ships, positioned specifically to absorb and deflect incoming fire, reported casualties before I had time to issue single order. Not damage reports, not shield degradation warnings. Casualties. Ships struck in multiple locations simultaneously, their shields overwhelmed not by the power of individual hits but by the sheer number of them arriving from different angles. At the same instant, the human weapons platforms did not fire in sequence. They fired in coordinated volleys, each volley calculated to arrive at the target from different vectors simultaneously so that the defensive systems could not prioritize or rotate shields effectively. Whoever had programmed those targeting solutions had understood Dominion shield architecture at a level of detail that the Imperial Intelligence Bureau had declared impossible for a pre-contact species. We were not fighting something primitive. I understood that completely in the first 90 seconds. Shields on sectors 4 through 11 are down, Hav reported. His voice was still professional, still controlled, though I could hear something underneath it now that I had never heard in Hav's voice before. Outer ring has lost contact with 14. Vessels. Shield regeneration is not keeping pace with incoming rate of fire. Return fire, I said. All batteries maximum output, target. The platforms. Targeting the platforms was easier to say than to do. The platforms were small, much smaller than any crewed warship, and they were dark. When they fired, the energy bloom briefly made them visible, but they did not fire continuously. They fired in timed bursts and then went cold again between volleys, which meant our targeting systems were effectively shooting at brief flashes of light that appeared and disappeared faster than the lock could stabilize. And there were so many of them. The intelligence files had noted that human orbital manufacturing capacity was limited. That was the word they had used. Limited. What limited apparently meant was not what I had assumed it meant, because the number of platforms now active around us was not consistent with 60 years of limited manufacturing capacity. It was consistent with a civilization that had decided at some point in the last several decades that building these platforms was the single most important thing it could do, and had quietly redirected enormous amounts of industrial output toward exactly that goal. Lieutenant Hav gave me the count at the 2-minute mark. 1,143 active platforms in positions that covered every vector. 400 warships surrounded by 1,143 weapons platforms inside a defensive lattice that we had spent 12 hours sailing into while the humans watched and waited and made sure every position was exactly right. At 4 minutes, we lost contact with a third of the fleet. I need you to understand what that means. Not lost communication. Communication systems were still functioning. Lost contact means the ships were no longer transmitting because they were no longer there. A third of the Imperial Third Armada, 133 vessels, with crews numbering in the hundreds each, gone in 4 minutes. Commander Varric of the 2nd Battle Group reported in at the 5-minute mark. His voice was the calmest thing I heard that day. Commander Vrethkal, he said, the 2nd Battle Group is attempting withdrawal along Vector 7. All withdrawal vectors are covered. We are taking fire on all bearings. I am recommending we concentrate remaining forces, and then his transmission ended. Not with static. It simply ended mid-sentence. Mid-thought, as if a switch had been thrown. I did not try to hail him again. I ordered the Armada to concentrate, to pull together, to use the sheer mass of our remaining ships to create overlapping shield coverage. It was the correct tactical response to encirclement. Reduce your perimeter. Increase your defensive density, force the enemy to concentrate their fire on a smaller target instead of distributing it across a wide formation. It might have worked against a different enemy, against an enemy with a fixed number of weapons in fixed positions. Concentrating would have allowed us to bring our own fire to bear effectively on specific targets while our shields held. But the platforms were not in fixed positions. As we concentrated, they moved. Not dramatically, they were not fast, but enough. They redistributed, maintained the encirclement, adjusted their targeting solutions to account for our new formation. Whoever was controlling them was watching us adapt and adapting faster. At 7 minutes, my own shields reached critical The Eternal Mandate was 4 km long. It had the heaviest shielding in the fleet, layered systems built to withstand sustained fire from multiple warships simultaneously. The platform fire was not as powerful per shot as a warship's main battery, but 1,143 platforms firing and rotating volleys from multiple vectors produced a cumulative effect that our systems had simply not been designed to absorb. PROV-6 reported the shield status in a voice that had stopped being professional and become something else. Something very young. Primary shields are down. Secondary shields at 31%. Tertiary buffer is a sound he did not finish describing. Tertiary buffer is gone. All power to secondary shields, I said. Commander, if we redirect power from weapons, we lose offensive capability. Entirely. We have not hit a single platform, I said. Redirect the power. It bought us perhaps 90 seconds. I want to tell you about the sound 4 km warship makes when it is being taken apart from the outside. It is not the dramatic explosion sound that Dominion cultural media has always used for battle sequences. It is quieter than that, which is somehow worse. A low, continuous structural moan as the hull absorbs energy it was not built to contain, as internal compartments vent and seal and vent again, as the systems that hold everything together begin to prioritize themselves out of the equation one by one. At 9 minutes, the bridge lost artificial gravity. For 30 seconds we were all floating. Equipment and personnel and data tablets. And one single cup of cold liquid that PROV-6 had been holding, all of it. Drifting, spinning slowly while the tactical display continued updating with information that had stopped meaning anything useful. I caught the edge of my command chair and held on and looked at the holographic display and counted what was left. I counted twice because the first count did not seem possible. 22 ships. Of 400. 22 ships, and most of them were showing the same cascade of system failures that the Eternal Mandate was showing, which meant 22 ships at perhaps 30% of their original combat effectiveness still inside an 1,100 platform lattice that had not stopped firing for 9 minutes and was not slowing down. At 10 minutes, I made the decision to transmit a general signal to the remaining fleet. Not a tactical order. Not a regrouping instruction. Just 2 words in the Dominion military code that every officer in the fleet would understand immediately. Preserve life. It meant stop fighting. It meant whatever action gives your crew the best chance of surviving the next few minutes, take that action. It meant I am releasing you from the battle plan because the battle plan no longer exists. At 11 minutes, the Eternal Mandate secondary shields collapsed entirely. The first whole breach was in the lower decks. Then another. Then the bridge viewport cracked, not broke, cracked, a single fracture line running diagonally across the transparent panel, and for one moment I could see through it clearly. I could see space outside. I could see the debris field that an hour ago had been 400 warships. I could see, at the edges of that field, shapes moving. Large shapes, angular, traveling without the frantic urgency of battle because the battle was already over. They were human ships. Real ones. Not the small assembled vessel that had met us at the approach. These were enormous, dark, angular, built with a practical ugliness that was somehow more intimidating than any elegant design could have been. They were moving through the debris field with purpose and precision. I thought for a moment that they were coming to finish us. They were not. The last thing I saw before the emergency bulkhead sealed the cracked viewport was a human vessel pulling alongside what remained of a Dominion escape pod, extending a docking arm, securing it, drawing it inside. They were collecting survivors. Every escape pod in the debris field. Everyone from every destroyed ship. From every crew member who had managed to reach one in the chaos of the last 11 minutes. The human ships were moving to collect them methodically, deliberately, without hesitation. I transmitted the order to abandon the eternal mandate 3 minutes later when it was clear that no power system could sustain us long enough for rescue or repair. I was the last one off. That is protocol, and protocol was one of the few things left intact. In my escape pod drifting, I had time to think. I had time to go back through the last 14 hours and find every moment where the cold, quiet feeling had tried to tell me something and trace each one forward to where it had led. The silence at hour 6. The debris that was not debris. The 17 languages. The ship that moved in a direction physics should not have allowed. Every single one of those moments had been a message, and I had read every single one of them as confirmation of what I already believed instead of as what they actually were. A species that had been waiting, that had been preparing, that had understood for decades what was coming and had spent every one of those decades getting ready for it with a quiet, deliberate, organized patience that was almost the opposite of how the intelligence files had described them. They were not fractured. They were not arguing tribes. What they were, I now understood, was a species that had spent all of its history learning to argue and fight and compete and still somehow survive at all, and had applied every lesson from every one of those conflicts to the problem of the Dominion's eventual arrival. They had not been primitive. They had been pretending. And I, Commander Vreth Call of the Imperial Dominion, with 41 conquests behind me and an Emperor's mandate in my pocket, had sailed 400 warships straight into the center of that pretense and never once questioned whether I might be wrong. The human docking arm found my pod 40 minutes later. It was gentle. The capture was smoother than most Dominion docking procedures I had experienced. A small door opened and warm light came through it, and a human face looked in at me with an expression I could not read at all. I had always been told that when a species could not be read, it meant they were simple. That complexity of expression required intelligence. The human face was not simple. It was the most complicated thing I had ever seen. There was something in it that might have been concern and something that might have been relief and something underneath both of those that I had no word for in any Dominion language. They helped me out of the pod with careful hands, and the door closed behind me, and I stood in a corridor of a human ship surrounded by the low sounds of a vessel at work, and I understood with complete clarity that I was not a prisoner of a primitive species. I was a guest or a captive, perhaps the distinction was unclear, of something the Dominion had never encountered before, and the Emperor's court was going to need a very different kind of report than the one I had been composing in my head since we left home. My name is Yeen, and until 6 weeks ago, was a staff officer aboard the Eternal Mandate, and I want to be honest with you. Before I say anything else, I am not sure I'm the same person who boarded the ship. The facility where they took us was called Cold Harbor Station. I learned this from a sign on the wall in the first corridor I walked through. Not a sign for our benefit, a sign that was simply there the way humans apparently label everything, every room, and every corridor and every piece of equipment, as if they are worried that someone will forget where they are. I was not the highest-ranking survivor. Commander Vrethkel was alive, and so were several senior officers from other vessels, but we were separated during processing, gently and without explanation, and I did not see the commander again for the first 3 weeks of our stay. Later I would learn that they separated us deliberately, not to isolate us, but because they had studied Dominion command hierarchies carefully enough to know that lower-ranking officers speak more freely when they are not in the presence of their superiors. This was not the action of a species that didn't understand how power worked. The rooms were small but not uncomfortable. A sleeping surface, a sanitation unit, a table, a chair, a window. The window looked out over a large body of water that caught the light in the early hours of the human day and turned colors I had never seen before. I spent a great deal of time at that window. There was nothing else to do, and the colors were genuinely extraordinary. They fed us 3 times a day. The food was not Dominion food. Chemistry was different, the flavors were different, but the nutrition was correct. They had analyzed our biological needs before we arrived, which meant they had analyzed Dominion biological requirements from something, and I could not determine from what source. We had never shared the data with any species. They had figured it out independently, with enough accuracy that none of the 6,000 survivors at Cold Harbor showed any nutritional deficiency in the first week. On the 4th day, the guard outside my room, a young male human with a calm face and very still hands, named Oliver, according to his identification badge, opened my door at the usual feeding time and stepped aside to reveal a second person standing in the corridor behind him. She was taller than Oliver, with dark hair pulled back from her face, wearing different clothes than any of the facility personnel I had seen so far. Not a uniform exactly, but deliberately chosen, presenting an impression of casual authority. She was carrying a printed document under one arm and a cup of something warm in her other hand, and she looked at me with the same complicated expression I had seen on the face of the human who had opened my escape pod. "I'm Dr. Helen Ward," she said, fluent Dominion standard, not the careful, slightly accented Dominion that some of our other human contacts had used. Fluent, comfortable, the Dominion of someone who had been speaking it for a long time. "I am a researcher. I study Dominion social organization and governance structures. I am not here to gather military intelligence. I would like to talk to you if that is acceptable." I sat at my table and gestured to the chair across from it because I could not think of a reason to refuse and was curious about her despite myself. She sat her day. She did not open her document. She did not produce a recording device. She set her cup on the table and folded her hands and looked at me, and the first thing she said was not a question about the fleet or the weapons platforms or a tactical systems. She said, "Your rank insignia, the arrangement of the three upper marks, indicates you hold a communication specialty. Am I reading that correctly?" I told her she was. My dissertation argued that Dominion signal officers hold a disproportionate amount of informal influence relative to their formal rank because information flow in hierarchical command structures creates unofficial power dynamics that the formal hierarchy doesn't acknowledge. I was very proud of that argument when I wrote it. I'm curious whether it actually reflects reality. I looked at her for a moment. Your dissertation? Yes. You wrote a dissertation on Dominion command structure. I wrote 4 papers on Dominion command structure, she said with the small expression that I was learning was called a smile. The dissertation was the longest one, 800 pages. It took me 6 years. And when did you begin writing it? I started the research when I was 24 years old. She picked up her cup. That was 19 years ago. 19 years ago. I did the calculation automatically. 19 years ago, the Dominion's nearest approach to the Sol system, our first genuine scouting mission, conducted under deep skin protocols that we had believed were undetectable, had taken place. You detected our scouting mission, I said. She did not look surprised that I had made the connection. We detected an anomalous gravitational signature consistent with a large artificial object traveling faster than light. Our physics at the time couldn't explain it. It was classified at the highest levels of about 30 different governments simultaneously, which was actually remarkable given how often those governments disagreed about everything else. She paused. It was the first time in recorded history that every nuclear-armed nation on Earth made the same decision on the same day without negotiating about it. First, what decision? To prepare, she said simply. To use whatever time we had to get ready, because we had no way of knowing if the next ship would be curious or hostile, and we couldn't afford to be wrong. This was the moment I began to understand that everything I had believed about Earth was precisely backward. We had looked at their conflicts and seen weakness. We had looked at their divisions and seen vulnerability. We had looked at a species that spent its own history in constant struggle and assumed that struggle had made them fragile. We had never considered that it might have made them very, very good at surviving. Dr. Ward came back every day after that. She never asked about military systems. She never asked about fleet deployment, or weapon specifications or shield technology. She asked about things like the relationship between formal rank and social status in Dominion culture. She asked about how Dominion children were educated. She asked about music, whether the Dominion had music, what it sounded like, whether it served a social function or a personal one. She was curious the way water is wet. It was not an act. She genuinely wanted to know. On the 9th day, I asked her why. Why what? She said. Why do you study us? The Dominion is your enemy. We came here with 400 ships. Why do you spend time learning about our music? She looked at me steadily for a moment before she answered. The Dominion is not my enemy, she said. The The decision to send an armada to conquer us was made by an emperor and a war council who never had to consider the possibility that we could say no. The decision is my problem. The people who make up the Dominion, the staff officers and the signal technicians and the researchers who study other civilizations' social structures, they are not my enemy. They are people who made choices in a system that didn't give them many other options. She paused. I study you because understanding you is how we make sure this never happens again, in either direction. On the 14th day, I asked her the question that had been sitting in my mind since the first morning at the window. You knew we were coming for 19 years. You built 1,100 weapons platforms. You decoded our communication protocols. You prepared a defensive lattice so complete that 400 warships couldn't find a way out of it. I paused. Why didn't you come to us first? You had faster-than-light technology. You had the capability. Why wait for us to come to you? She was quiet for a long moment. Because we hoped you'd turn around. She said, just that. No elaboration. No strategic explanation. No calculation of military advantage or political gain. They had hoped we would turn around. I sat with that answer for the rest of the day and most of the night. I thought about the Dominion War Council in their chamber looking at Earth and seeing a primitive species not worth a serious military force. I thought about the scouting report that had sat on the Emperor's desk and been summarized in 3 sentences. I thought about the intelligence analyst with his bright eyes telling me they were arguing tribes who couldn't agree on resource distribution. They had detected us 19 years before we arrived. They had spent 19 years building, preparing, calculating, organizing, and in all of that time, in all of that preparation, the fundamental hope had not been that they would win. It had been that we would not come at all. The 6th week brought a change in the facility's routine. The other Dominion survivors began appearing at shared meals, not all at once, in small groups quietly in a dining hall that had clearly been arranged to allow accidental proximity without forced interaction. I saw faces I recognized from the Armada. Some of them looked like I imagined I looked. Some of them looked worse. Commander Vreth Skull was not among them. On the day before our scheduled departure, they had told us we were going home, all 6,000 of us. Unconditional return, no delay. Dr. Ward came for a final conversation. She brought a document this time. She set it on the table between us. It was a single sheet. This is the only thing we are asking you to take back, she said. It's a formal declaration. It states that Earth considers this engagement resolved. It states that we have no hostile intentions toward any Dominion world or citizen. It requests that the Dominion acknowledge the result of this engagement and refrain from further expeditions to the Sol system. I looked at the document. It was written in both Dominion Standard and 23 human languages. And if the Dominion sends another Armada, I asked. She folded her hands on the table. Then we will respond to it, she said. But we would prefer not to. I picked up the document. It was lighter than it should have been, given what it represented. Dr. Ward, I said, I need to ask you something honestly. Please. Do you think the Dominion will turn around? Genuinely. Knowing what you know about us. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I think some of the people in the Dominion, after what happened here, will argue for it very strongly. I think that argument will be difficult to make. I think the outcome will depend on whether the Emperor listens to those people or to the ones who tell him that what happened was a temporary setback that can be overcome with a larger force." She met my eyes. "It will not be overcome with a larger force," she said. "I want you to know that clearly. Not as a threat. As a fact. We have been preparing for 19 years and we have no intention of stopping." I believed her completely. On the morning of our departure, I stood at the window for the last time and watched the light change on the water. A human officer named Peter, quiet, efficient with a steady calmness that reminded me oddly of the best Dominion officers I had served with, came to tell me that the transport was ready. I took the document that Dr. Ward had left me and folded it carefully into the inside pocket of my uniform. In the corridor, I passed Oliver, the guard with the still hands who had stood outside my door for 6 weeks. He nodded at me. I nodded back. It was a very small thing. It felt in the moment significant. The transport was clean and well maintained, and the journey back to Dominion space took 4 days. I spent those 4 days writing. Not the kind of report that the War Council would want, the tactical analysis, the weapon specifications, the assessment of human military capability. I wrote that too because it was required and because they deserved accurate information. But I also wrote something else. I wrote about Dr. Ward and her 800-page dissertation. I wrote about the window and the way the light moved on the water. I wrote about Oliver's still hands in the dining hall and the food that had been chemically correct even before we arrived. I wrote about a species that had detected us 19 years ago and spent every one of those years getting ready, and whose fundamental hope in all of that time had simply been that we would not come. I wrote about what it meant to fight wars against yourself for your entire history and still be here, still surviving, still curious about your enemy's music and the informal power dynamics of your command hierarchy. I wrote about what it meant to be afraid for a very long time and choose to use that fear as a tool rather than as an excuse. And then I wrote the line that I knew would end my career and might, if I was lucky, start something else. My recommendation is that the Imperial Dominion open diplomatic communication with Earth, not negotiation, not terms of engagement, communication. We have encountered for the first time in 600 years a species that hoped we would turn around. I believe we should. I looked at the last line for a long time. Then I sent it. The War Council chamber in the Imperial capital is built to be overwhelming. I had been there once before for an award ceremony after the Third Conquest, and I remembered thinking then that the architecture was designed specifically to make the individual feel small. The ceiling that vanished into darkness above the long table where the council sat in elevated chairs, the single standing position at the room's center, where whoever was being addressed had to remain without support, exposed from all angles. I stood in that position and delivered my account. They had already received the official battle reports. They already knew the numbers. What they wanted from me, the only survivor of the eternal mandates, command staff to return with a coherent narrative, was something the numbers couldn't give them. They wanted an explanation. They wanted a reason. They wanted something they could use to understand how 400 warships had been destroyed in 11 minutes so that they could prevent it from happening again. Admiral Gren, the senior military council member, spoke first. He was old, even by Dominion standards, with the careful, deliberate speech of someone who had spent a century learning never to reveal what he was thinking. Staff Officer Yin, he said, your report identifies no tactical flaw in the fleet's approach. You report no equipment failure, no communication breakdown, no lapse in command protocol. You report that the fleet operated exactly as it was designed to operate. Yes, Admiral. And yet the fleet was destroyed. Yes, Admiral. Then what you are telling this council is that our fleet was correctly deployed against an enemy we had assessed as primitive and was nonetheless comprehensively defeated. Yes, Admiral. That is precisely what I am telling you. There was a silence around the long table that had a texture to it like something just before a storm. Explain to this council, Gren said, how a species with chemical propellant, rockets and primitive atomic technology managed to destroy 400 of the most advanced warships in the Dominion. I had prepared for this question. I had spent 4 days on the transport, preparing for it, and several more days after returning preparing for it, and I want to tell you that my answer was eloquent and comprehensive and strategically framed. It was not. It was the truth, stated plainly, because I had spent 6 weeks in a room with a woman who studied things honestly, and I had come to believe that honesty was the only response that served anyone. They did not have chemical propellant, rockets and primitive atomic technology, I said. They had that infrastructure visible on the surface. They had been quietly building something entirely different in orbit for approximately 38 years, which is when they first detected our presence in the outer regions of their solar system. The room was very still. The intelligence files were compiled from long-range passive observation, I continued. They accurately described what Earth looked like from a distance. They did not account for the possibility that Earth was aware of our observation and was deliberately presenting a specific appearance. Admiral Grain's expression did not change. The expressions of the other council members changed slightly in different ways, none of which were reassuring. You are suggesting, he said carefully, that a pre-contact species with no experience of interstellar civilization successfully identified and countered our surveillance protocols. Yes, Admiral. And built a hidden orbital infrastructure over a period of decades. Yes, Admiral. And decoded our communication systems. Yes, Admiral. Without any outside assistance. I paused. I cannot confirm or deny outside assistance. What I can tell you is that Dr. Helen Ward, the human researcher who interviewed me during our detention, indicated that they had reverse engineered our faster-than-light propulsion concept from the gravitational signature of our first scouting mission. She said this casually, as if it were obvious. The council member to Grain's left, I did not know her name. She held no rank. Insignia I recognized, said something quietly to the member beside her. I could not hear it. What is your assessment, Grain said, of Earth's military capability relative to the Dominion? This was the question I had been most afraid of and most prepared for. My assessment is that 1,143 weapons platforms operated with the tactical sophistication they demonstrated are not the limit of Earth's defensive capability. They are the capacity Earth chose to reveal. I believe they have additional assets they did not deploy. On what basis do you believe that? On the basis that they did not pursue the remaining 22 ships when those ships withdrew. 1,100 platforms against 22 crippled vessels could have achieved complete elimination of all survivors. They did not attempt it. They stopped firing at the same moment the last intact vessel crossed a specific distance threshold, a threshold that I believe corresponds to a calculated decision about how much force to use, not a limit of available force. Silence again. They chose to let survivors go, I said. They collected our escape pods. They held 6,000 prisoners comfortably, returned all of them unconditionally, and sent back a single-page document requesting that we not come back. I paused. This is not the behavior of a species that fought to the limit of its capability. It is the behavior of a species that used exactly as much force as it decided was necessary and then stopped. Deliberately. Admiral Grain looked at me for a very long moment. And your recommendation, Staff Officer Yin, based on this assessment? I had rehearsed this part most carefully, not because I was uncertain of it, but because I understood that how I said it might matter as much as what I said. My recommendation is that the Dominion not return to the Sol system with another military force, I said. Not because we lack the capability to construct a larger armada. Not because I believe Earth is invincible, but because the strategic calculus does not favor it. Earth has had 19 years to prepare for one armada. Every year that passes increases their preparation time for the next one. The advantage of surprise that we might have held 19 years ago does not exist. The advantage of technological superiority that the intelligence files assumed we held has been demonstrably eliminated, and the cost to the Dominion of another failed engagement in ships, personnel, in Imperial credibility across 91 subject worlds would be significant. I stopped. I took one breath. But that is the tactical recommendation, I said. I also have a different one. One that is not tactical. The Council waited. The humans returned 6,000 Dominion soldiers without conditions. They sent a message asking us not to come back rather than a declaration of war. They could have held us as leverage. They could have threatened us. They have a researcher who has spent 19 years studying Dominion government structure, which means they have been preparing for diplomatic engagement as long as they have been preparing for military engagement. They gave us every possible opening to choose something other than another conflict. I looked at the long table at all those faces that I could not read any better than I had been able to read Dr. Ward's. On that first day, they hoped we would turn around, I said, at every possible stage. They built weapons and they hoped we wouldn't make them use them. They kept every one of our people safe. and they hoped we would understand what that meant. They are offering us something the Dominion has not been offered in 600 years, a species that wants to deal with us rather than be conquered by us. I reached into the inside pocket of my uniform and placed a single sheet document on the floor in front of me, because there was no surface to put it on in the center of the room. They asked us to acknowledge the result and refrain from further expeditions. I am asking this council to do more than that. I am asking you to respond, not with another armada, with a message. The silence lasted a very long time. Admiral Grant picked up his own document from the table and looked at it for a moment that stretched. This council will deliberate on your recommendations, he said in his careful, revealing nothing voice. You are dismissed. I walked out of the chamber. My footsteps on the stone floor were very loud in the quiet. Behind me, I heard voices beginning low and quick and urgent, and I did not try to hear what they said. In my quarters that night, alone with the lights low, I wrote in a private record that I have kept since childhood. I write in it when I need to understand something. Sometimes the writing itself is the understanding. I wrote, there is a species at the third planet of a yellow star in the Orion Arm that has been afraid for as long as it has existed. It grew up on a world that tried to end it in 100 different ways: ice, ages, collisions, the unpredictable violence of its own biology, the constant competition of a crowded, complicated ecosystem. It survived all of it. And then it survived itself, century after century, conflict after conflict, each one leaving it more practiced at the thing it most needed to be practiced. That, I wrote, they fight like a species that knows exactly what it is fighting for. And they stopped fighting the same way. The precision with which they went to war and the precision with which they stopped it are the same precision. They did not get lucky. They have been preparing for everything, including the part after the fight. I wrote, the Dominion has never met a species that hoped we would turn around. I did not know, until I heard it said plainly, how much that would matter to me. I did not know that it was possible to be a military force and also be hoping genuinely that the force would never be needed. I wrote, I have filed my recommendation. I have told the truth. What happens next is the council's decision, and then the emperor's decision, and then history's decision. I wrote, I hope they turn around. And then I closed the record and lay back on my sleeping surface and looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about a window and a body of water and light that moved across it in the early hours of an alien morning, and a woman with a cup of something warm and 800 pages of careful, honest research who had looked at the species that came to conquer her world and chosen to understand it rather than hate it. The Dominion had spent 600 years being the thing that other species were afraid of. We had taken pride in that. We had built monuments to it and written histories around it and trained our children on its certainty. I had met the species that was not afraid of us, not because they were naive or unaware of the danger, but because they had taken their fear and turned it into something else entirely, something patient and careful, and prepared, and still, underneath all of it, hopeful. They were more frightening than anything we had ever conquered. They were more frightening precisely because they did not want to be frightening, because they built 1,100 weapons platforms and maintain the sincere hope that no one would ever make them. Use them. I fell asleep thinking about that. The most dangerous thing in the known universe had turned out to be a species that wanted peace badly enough to spend 19 years making absolutely certain it could enforce one. In the morning, I would find out what the council decided. But for now, for one quiet night in a room that felt very small after 6 weeks of looking at a wide and colorful sea, I let myself simply be a person who had learned something true and was grateful to be alive to have learned it. And I hoped very sincerely that the Emperor was wise enough to listen.